Starting the unit on forensic psychology, then, we're going to start with a couple of lessons looking at offender profiling and the two different ways that police officers can approach profiling. So offender profiling in general is something which you see quite frequently in criminal dramas. Mindhunter, Criminal Minds, Waking the Dead, they all use an aspect of offender profiling. And the general idea behind it is that you or the police officer will take clues from the scene of the crime and they'll put them together to create an estimated profile of what an offender might be like, with the intention that you can narrow down suspects and you have a better chance of catching the criminal. Now, there are two broad approaches to offender profiling, one which was developed by the Americans, the FBI, and the second which was developed by the UK. In this screencast, we're going to look at the top-down approach, which is the American approach, and then in the next screencast, we'll compare that to the UK or the bottom-up approach. So, the top-down approach to offender profiling involves taking predefined categories of different offender types, and there are two types which we'll come on to in a moment. The investigating officer will then look at the crime scene and the evidence that's available to them, and using clues from that crime scene, they'll place the offenders into one of the two categories using a best fit method. Now, this is a method which relies quite heavily on the intuition and the experience of the person doing the investigating. Now, the two types of offenders which the top-down approach has suggested are known as organised and disorganised, and they are characterised in the following way. So, organised criminals tend to have a particularly targeted victim, so it's not chosen at random. The crime tends to be planned, so it's premeditated and well controlled. The offender tends to show forensic awareness, so this means that the scene will be cleared of forensic evidence, DNA, fingerprints, and they will move the body from the scene of the crime or they hide it in some way. Now, an organised offender is generally considered to be very intelligent and well educated and socially competent, which means they get on well with other people and they wouldn't necessarily come across as somebody that you would suspect. The theory also states that they probably had inconsistent discipline when they were a child and that they tend to be an older sibling. Now, in contrast to this, disorganised offenders are pretty much the opposite. So a disorganised offender would have a random victim. The crime would be impulsive. They might grab somebody, it'd be opportunistic, and they would tend to leave the body and the weapon at the scene. So they would be socially immature, so not socially competent like an organised offender. They'd probably have a poor work history and they probably live alone and quite close to the crime scene. So it's considered that they probably had harsh discipline as a child and they tend to be the younger sibling. So once offenders have been categorised into organised or disorganised, the investigating officers can then use 7 different factors to help build a more detailed picture of the offenders. So the first factor they might look at is the murder type. So this is whether or not the murder is premeditated or whether it's one in a series. The second thing they might look at is the primary intent. So this links into whether or not the crime is premeditated or whether it was an impulsive crime. They would also look at victim risk and offender risk. Now, victim risk is about whether the victim presents a high or low risk to the offender. So a high risk victim would be somebody who's important, somebody who would be missed, who's got family, who would report them perhaps. A low risk victim would be maybe somebody who is homeless and there may not be anybody around to report their disappearance. Offender risk is how much of a risk the offender is likely or has taken within that crime. So a high risk crime would be in broad daylight, maybe somewhere where they might be seen, and a low risk crime would be somewhere maybe at night and away from the public eye. So all of those things can tell them a little bit more about what the offender is like. The fifth thing they might consider is escalation. So this could be previous escalation from another crime or possible escalation for future crimes. And then they would also consider time factors and location factors. So this is about where and when the crime was carried out and what that might tell us about the offender. So more information on all of this is in your pre-reading, and before you come into the lesson, make sure you have a good understanding about what we mean by offender profiling. Make sure you can explain what top-down refers to, so that's about having the categories already prepared. Describe the features of the 2 categories of criminals used in the top-down approach, and explain how the 7 areas of investigation can lead to placing offenders into one of the 2 categories and building a detailed profile.